Hey there, this is Scott Steen. I'm the founder of Prepared to Answer, and you are listening to a special edition of the Prepared to Answer podcast, in which I'm joined by my colleague, Matt Belfay, from way across the ocean in Scotland. Matt's ministry is called Truth Snack, whose mission is to help doubting Christians become adventurous truth seekers so that they can believe with confidence. And you can find Matt on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Just search for Truth Snack. And of course, as always, you can find us online as well at www.preparedtoanswer.org and also on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram at Prepared to Answer. Now, just to set you up for our discussion, on July 12th, Jordan Peterson, the acclaimed Canadian psychology professor who has rocketed in notoriety over the past few years, he released a video on his YouTube channel entitled Message to the Christian Churches. In it, he gives some very clear advice, maybe almost describe it as instruction, to churches with regard to the role we have to play in tending to the souls of young men, which is a subject for him that is extremely important, and that's often reflected in his speaking and his writing as well. Since I am not what you might call a young man, unless, of course, you're 80, I decided it would be fun to unpack Peterson's message with my teammate, Matt, who is a young man. So we hopped on a Zoom call and hit record so that we could share with you our own thoughts and reactions to what Jordan Peterson has to say to Christian churches.
Okay, but yeah, so I guess let's start. When you saw it, now that we've gone over our emails, what was interesting enough about it that you passed it off to me? Like, I had seen it, but you thought it would be interesting for me to.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things. I've been following Jordan Peterson for some time, and I've written a number of, I don't want to say articles. I'm more trying to analyze the things he's saying. But I think I sent it to you because you more closely represent the demographic that is his burden and is the subject. Really, it's the heart of this message to the churches.
Right.
At the very core of it is Christian churches, you need to pick up the ball that our culture has dropped, which is helping young men to fulfill their life purpose. That's not something new. It's not something he hasn't said before in terms of his concern about young men. And that very much comes out in some of his books, like his 12 Rules book. Anyway, so I just thought I'd be interested to hear what you're hearing from him and what, if anything, you think is significant about what he's talking about. I also thought it was interesting because you and I are both, coming out of a Christian tradition, I guess we would say an evangelical Christian background. Christians are very interested in what Jordan Peterson is saying, generally speaking.
Mm.
I'm curious, though, when he's in directing his message directly to the Christian church. Okay, we're part of the Christian church. Well, let's process. What is he saying? What's he saying that we ought to be listening to? What is he saying, if anything, that we ought to maybe be a little more circumspect about?
Yeah.
There's a lot there. Jordan Peterson is fascinating. I like him. I love listening to him. There's something really significant going on with him in terms of his progression in thought, particularly toward the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And many Christians are seeing him as kind of a champion for Christianity in the culture.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to start with my thoughts, I think, because I did watch it back. I took some notes. I agree that Christians want to make Jordan Peterson a champion because he has a big platform. He's a globally recognized name, and he is, he has a favorable disposition towards Christianity, and we like that. Now, I don't know if I would call him a champion or want him to be a champion of Christianity. And this is where it's the first thing I wrote is I don't want to twice exile him, which is something that's a term.
What is that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So that term, it's a term. I think it was coined by Makoto Fujimura, who is a Christian artist. And And so I won't relate it to his experience, but people experience being twice exiled. This is what I mean. So Jordan Peterson is going to come across sometimes as too Christian for people who aren't Christians, and he's going to come across as not Christian enough for Christians. And so he doesn't fit into either group necessarily super well. And so what I don't want to do is to go, well, here are my reflections. He wasn't Christian enough and his theology wasn't good enough for me. And to like exile him this way, he's not a theologian. And so I give him grace in that. He's a psychologist, and he does some things in his video that I think are really interesting. He makes some very pointed assessments about culture and woke culture and these ideologies. I wouldn't like claim to affirm him or say he's wrong because I just don't know, but I do go, okay, here's someone who is engaging this on a level that is far deeper than myself. So I would just go, yeah, I think that position that you brought forward at the beginning is good. There are probably some things that he's saying that are worth listening to, but then it's also probably helpful to be reflective of what he's saying before we automatically receive it, because he's a psychologist. He's not a theologian, and he's not claiming to be, and he's not even necessarily a Christian. I don't even know if he would call himself that. So, I'm not going to say he has no value, but there's a tension there that I have with him. And I think that comes out when he says stuff. I go, I agree with you. And then I think, honestly, he has a swing and a miss a few times theologically in this video. Yeah. We could unpack that more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm the same. I think sometimes I think this is characteristic of our social media or broader culture, which, again, I'm always conscious of the irony of critiquing in any way social media culture through a social media medium.
Right.
But I'm aware that a lot of times people won't allow you to take a middle road. And I've tried to do this in the past. In saying I like Jordan Peterson, I like listening to him. I think he has some very helpful things to say. I think some of his cultural diagnoses are spot on. Even some of the things he says about the teachings of Scripture and Christian tradition, I think have merit as well. But at the same time, I'm not convinced he's quite there. And that's not to critique him. To me, that's just an assessment of where he's at. And that's not a judgment. That's just from listening to him, I just sense that he's a person who is on a journey. And I have prayed for him myself personally because I would love to see him come to Christ. But I don't think he's there yet. But I just think he's so close. And what I think is interesting about him, I'm trusting in God's grace that he will come to Christ. But I think what he provides is a really interesting, an example of an intellectual's journey to faith on a very intellectual pathway. I mean, he's just a brilliant thinker. But anyway, that's kind of an aside. I'm trying to qualify myself before I say anything else, so that people don't say, "Oh, you're against him. Oh, you're for him." And I'm not. I'm neither. I'm just.
Yeah.
I just think he has some useful insights, but also that there's this phenomenon of a growing enthusiasm within the Christian community. And I think there's something we have to be cautious of in that. But anyway, why don't we look into the content of his message? This was a 10-minute video that he released a couple weeks ago, a message to the Christian church. And I think the one thing that is worth just even saying, this, he's right, this is something that needs to be accounted for, is he starts off by just basically saying, kind of recalling how he became a personality or a spokesman for the Christian voice, if you will, in the broader culture. And he points back to 2017 when he and his family rented out a theater in Toronto, and he decided to do a series of lectures on the book of Genesis. And that's what he references in the video. And albeit he acknowledges they were a psychological analysis of the stories. And of course, that's wrapped into his roots in Jungian psychology and archetypes and all those kinds of things. But what I thought was interesting, and he's right, and I'd like to talk about this for a minute, is he said, we didn't know if there'd be an interest in this, but we decided to do it anyway. And he says, lo and behold, miracle of miracles, it was sold out for 15 weeks. He sold out that theater and subsequently had millions of views online, predominantly both in the theaters and online. The audience was young men. And he even says it in the video. He says, this is a phenomenon that can't easily be accounted for. What I think is just interesting, worth talking about right away, is what's going on? Well, that is in itself an interesting phenomenon. That here's a guy. Let's leave his nature of his faith commitment aside. He rents out a theater and does lectures on the book of Genesis, and captures a predominantly young male audience. Like, what explains that? Like, what explains that phenomenon? What is attracting young men to his message?
Yeah. He says it's not easily accounted for, but implies that it is there is an account of it. Mm-hmm. This is where I just go, yeah, he's a psychologist. He has identified that in young men, there is a longing to fight for a cause that is worthwhile and to live a meaningful life. And you're right. Like, I 100% identify with that. And that's even part of my testimony of coming to Jesus. As a 14-year-old, I went to a youth conference that spoke very inspiringly about Jesus' desire to transform the world and that you could be a world changer with him. And that was my entry level into Christianity. I was like, yeah, Jesus is wanting to transform the world for the better. And I just wanted to be part of that. Now, my understanding of what that meant transformed and grew over time and is continuing to do that as I understand Jesus and how he wants to transform the world. But what got me hooked is that base level that Jordan Peterson is talking about. Like he says around the 7-minute 30 mark, we want to, imploring churches, we want to call you to the highest purpose of your life. Even now I read that, I'm like, dang, that's like inspiring. Like, yeah, I'm inspired and called to by that. So yeah, like, why is that phenomenon? I don't know, but I'm part of that target audience that he's talking about, that like when he wants to speak about life in that way, I'm just raise my hand. Like, yeah, I'm a young man who hears that language and goes, that inspires me to live my life for a purpose greater than myself. So I think that what he's done is just good psychology. He's identified part of the wiring of young men, and he's leaned into it because it's something that he actually cares about. So I don't think that is like mind-boggling that he's sorted that. That's what he's a professional in. So I'm not surprised that he's uncovered this nugget. It definitely resonates with me.
Yeah, and I've read in other places too. A lot of the comments I've read, even in the thread associated to this video, talking about, why are young men attracted to Jordan Peterson? And there's this appeal, which is it's kind of countercultural. Someone made the comment of, there actually is a place, particularly among young men, that we do need authority figures in our lives. They made the comment that Peterson almost comes across like a sage or a mentor figure. And he speaks with authority because he's trained and educated and he's knowledgeable. And young men respond to that.
And he's an educator.
Right.
Right. He's a professor. Like, that's what he is.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, like, you could call it sage, but I would just put it under like he's doing everything a rabbi does. He's teaching. He has authority. He's telling you to follow him. He has rules. He has a philosophy of life. He's inspiring you with purpose. Like, yeah. So, I mean, I would just, yeah, I think that's right. Like, I think everyone, I don't know if everyone, I definitely want like wise rabbis in my life. I have a rabbi. His name is Jesus too. Right. So it's like, that is an inspiring, or a paradigm of life that I'm like willing to put myself under. And I think he's just identifying something psychology, which for young men it is scary as you come up through your adolescent years to bring yourself into the light and put yourself under the scrutiny of wiser, more mature people than yourself or even your peers, for them to have access to your true life and to critique it and actually call you to something higher. And a lot of young men don't ever step out of that. And they grow up and they're just immature men who hurt people and their families. But then if you are brave enough to do that, then I think that's the, the fork in the road that Jordan Peterson finds himself at, is he's asking young men to not be adolescents. And we know from the good research that's being done by the Fuller Youth Institute and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada that adolescence is delayed, right? Like, so people are just taking longer to mature. So now you have 32-year-olds, 35-year-old men who haven't yet gone, I'm going to bring my life into the light and let it be scrutinized by peers, rabbis, God, and Jordan Peterson is just making that call. He's not necessarily calling people to let their lives be scrutinized by God, but he's inviting them to adopt a different paradigm of how to live. He's calling people to grow up, and he's the one who loves Jungian archetypes. Like, the reason the story of Peter Pan is so profound is because we all don't want to grow up, but then one day we realize we do want to. And he's isolated that in our culture.
Yeah. So now he's speaking to the church, and it seems like he's calling out in general a failure in the Christian church to do or provide those very things for young men. The kinds of things he's tried to provide in his teaching and his books. Is he right? I
think, I'll speak for the evangelical church that I've experienced. He is right. And also my field is youth ministry, right? So it's like I stand at that crossroads of begging young people to grow up. So I know what it's like to work with, young men and women who I'm inviting them to see their lives in a more mature way, but also their faith. And I think that he's right in the sense that at the 10-minute mark, as he's kind of wrapping up, he expresses emphatically, ask more, not less of them. And I think in that, again, he's presenting a paradigm that is correct. I think we want to make following Jesus sound easy for people because we're afraid we're gonna drive them away. We will if they're an adolescent and never want to do hard things in their life. But at some point, they'll probably realize that everything great in life is hard.
Yeah.
Having a fulfilling career, having a family, having a spouse, like, these are hard things, but they're all the best things. And so I think to say, ask more, I think he's right. I think we've worked hard to make it sound as though following Jesus is easy, when one of the central illustrations Jesus has for what it means to follow him is to die every day and to put yourself on an altar. And for those who grab on to that call, like, those are the people that are going to take their faith seriously. It's funny to me that sometimes evangelicals worry that we're going to tell people the gospel and then they're going to accept it, and then they're not going to change their lives. We're always worried about that. Then they're not going to change. They're just going to go, oh, great, God forgives me. I'm going to live however I want. If we have that fear, I think that we have presented a gospel that is less than what Jesus asks, which is to actually become a follower of him who is ready to take up your own cross, because that's the paradigm of discipleship, is death and resurrection over and over again. So I think that he's right that churches have gone towards, let's make this as easy as possible. I think that following Jesus is definitely worth it. But of course, Christ makes it abundantly clear it is not always going to be easy. But that's how we access life abundantly, through death and resurrection, even our literal death and resurrection one day.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. No, I appreciate getting your insight. I think it's the generational difference here, because you're a generation younger than I am, and I think he diagnoses, like he says, it's hard to account for, but then in his accounting of this phenomenon, that his lectures on the book of Genesis attracted this young male audience. Yeah, his rather direct and authoritative speaking to young men, calling them to be men to step up and be men is resonating. And then he gives his diagnosis for why he thinks that is a phenomenon. Because men, young men in particular, are, whether consciously or unconsciously, they're reacting emotionally or psychologically, or however he wants to put it, to the anti-male sentiment that has captivated Western culture. He talks about, first of all, how the West has been construed as culturally as an oppressive patriarchy, that's the heartbeat of Western culture, that humanity itself is actually a blight on the world, like some kind of a cancer, he says. And then the third, that the prime contributor for the first two is the tyranny of basically the male ethos, that masculinity is essentially destructive, and that's the root of the problem. That's his cultural analysis. That's what he sees as, help us explain this phenomenon. That why is it that young men are gravitating to his message, to his teaching, to that kind of thing? And I think he's saying it's because the alternative they're getting from the culture is that being male is fundamentally bad, which is very discouraging if you're a male, and particularly if you want the kind of masculinity that he's talking about, or if that, obviously, for young men, being masculine should be a natural impulse, masculinity properly understood. To me, it's like the root of his messaging is that he's trying to, albeit from a psychological, archetypical kind of perspective, but he's trying to recover the fact that true masculinity is actually life-giving for humanity. Can it be abused? Absolutely. Has it been? Yes. But it's almost like he's saying the alternative of the world, the deconstructionists, is to basically see it entirely as something that has to be jettisoned wholesale. And he wants to recover that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the word deconstruction, because that's where my brain was going. But I see him as trying to deconstruct our current culture, because my philosophy of deconstruction is you're trying to remove distortions, but maintain. You're trying to maintain the authentic core, right? Mm-hmm. And so we could call that culture that's like almost kind of deconstructing all of what it would mean to be male. And I think he is deconstructing that too, but going, you know what, he's identified a psychological desire. He uses words like to find a woman, a garden to walk in, a land to conquer. And I think the culture that he's speaking against would have immediate problems with that language that he said, idea of conquering or a woman to find. But I think you're right in that he's trying to remove some, like in a sense, deconstruct the culture, like he's deconstructing a deconstructing culture. And he's going, they've distorted parts of what it means to be male. What you said, like, the masculinity that is a normal impulse. And he's trying to redeem it. He's trying to say, wait a second. So there are these desires that you have as a man that are not actually bad desires. They're actually good desires to be pursued. He uses biblical language, land to conquer, garden to walk in. Those are clear allusions to Genesis and Exodus, right? Mm-hmm. So, and beyond. So I think he's done, or I think he's doing a good job of identifying those passions in men. I think he, like I said, I resonate with them. And he's saying, don't let your church just be a social club. Don't let it be an anemic, rule club for moral living. If you just follow these rules and don't do these really bad things, then you're fine. It's more than that. And that's where the youth worker in me resonates, because, so many youth actually leave the faith as they grow up anyway. That making it as easy as possible hasn't worked as a strategy. So my strategy as a youth worker is not to make it harder than it is, but to just be honest. Like, if you want to follow Jesus, it's going to be work. It's going to be effort. But that's what it means to trust Jesus, is that as I lay down my life, you will resurrect it into something bigger and greater. So I don't know if you have more thoughts on that.
No, just a little bit more, I think, on what I think is at the heart of what he's trying to get at is recovering masculinity to the point where it's no longer seen as a negative.
Mm-hmm.
I think the church has something to be. I think that we can learn something from that, but I think it's a very nuanced converation.
And that's where, I totally. You go ahead.
Because, if I were to say we need to recover masculinity, the problem is there are negative or damaging masculine stereotypes or masculine ideas of masculinity that have crept into the culture that aren't good, that aren't life-giving, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it's kind of the way our culture has gone to, it's like we can only live in these polarized camp of extremes. Either it's all good or it's all bad. And so, Peterson has been demonized by many, who call him a misogynist and a woman hater, and he's patriarchal and all those things, because he's calling young men to be men. And he's clearly stating that there is a fundamental difference between men and women, which is a very unpopular thing to say in our world today, even though it's true. And I think as Christians, we want to say yes to that. And I think we should. But I think we want to be careful not to then use that as an excuse to justify reintroducing non-life-giving masculine models.
I agree. I think you've hit it there, is that he is trying to say there is a healthy version of you being a man and following some of these impulses. What he does well is he does criticize abuses in churches. He acknowledges it, and that's okay. Like I'm okay with that. So I think that he's done that well enough. He's identified a desire and he's trying to say, not all of these desires are bad. I think you've mentioned that, yes, this is an unbelievably nuanced conversation. And neither of us are prepared today to start discussing exactly what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. But he's thought about this. And if nothing else, he's presented just what we said. It's okay. You have some of these desires. They're not all bad. And that is a message that he's telling Christian churches to go after. Now, this is probably where, and I would just go, sure, I would agree with that. This is where if I'm going to critique him in this video, this is where my critique comes from, is that he's inspiring young men to conquer a land, to find a garden to walk in, to find a woman. In other words, in my words, he's inspiring them to build a kingdom, but he doesn't mention a king. And so he's doing a really good job of saying, you have a purpose in life and pursue that purpose, but he doesn't talk about what that purpose is and how that purpose should be fulfilled. And that's where I'm like, he's a psychologist. He's identified a psychological longing in people, but he didn't. And he said, churches, go after that. But he didn't say, guess what? That purpose can be building the kingdom of God under King Jesus. I don't even think he mentioned Jesus in the whole video. And so that's part of it. Is my criticism of him is, good job. You've identified kind of that base layer that we have these desires, but you didn't tell us anything about how to go about living out those desires. You just kind of passed the ball off to churches and said, this is a negative word, but capitalize on this desire and invite men in and give them a purpose. I'll let you decide what you think that is. Now, maybe I shouldn't expect Jordan Peterson to give that. Again, he's not a theologian, but he's just kind of going, hey, church. The most negative bent on this video that I can take is he's basically going, hey, churches, here's a really good strategy. Why don't you use it? And I go, okay, you're not wrong, but you also didn't I'm not sure you presented this in the most life-giving way possible. Like some churches will go, yeah, let's do that. But he spoke nothing of what those desires to build and to protect and to live for something meaningful, what that should all culminate in.
Yeah.
And Christians will say that should all culminate in the rule of God through his kingdom. And he never even got close to that because he's not a theologian.
Well, you're exactly right. And I think that is where, as I have listened to him over time, and I'm still listening to him now, he's because he's talking to a lot of really influential Christians, none in the evangelical community, but Orthodox, Catholic. He's having significant conversations. And so it's like he is engaging in discussion around the very heart of the Christian faith, which is Christ. But to date, I have not yet heard anything that would lead me to think he's escaped his Jungian matrix of thinking, that Christ is an exemplar. And I've written about this in another article that I'm going to link in this episode. That the difficulty is that he sees so much positive in Jesus, but ultimately he sees in Jesus is pointing to some other greater reality that we need to aspire to. And what he doesn't see is that Jesus is the reality, that Jesus is the king we need to follow. And I think I think you're right. That's where my critique would also land, that his call to the church reflects his understanding of Christian faith at this point, that it's just archetypical, that we just need to call young men back to their inherently understood maleness, and that will lead to their flourishing. But the problem is, and that's why the message of saying we need to recover masculinity is nuanced, because masculinity apart from the gospel, right? Unless I'm living out my masculinity in obedience to Jesus, it will be misdirected in some way, shape, or form. And even if I am following Jesus, I'm going to continue to stumble as a man. But I think that is what's missing. He's kind of putting forward a very human empowered program for the church. Just invite young men in and help them live out their purpose as young men.
Yeah, well, that's where I would almost amend it. It's not help them live out their purpose, because he doesn't go there. He says, and help them fulfill this desire to live out a purpose is right. What he's calling them to. And that's where, again, like if I'm the most critical I'm going to be is that at the end of this video, I just kind of go, sure, you brought us in at entry level, mm-hmm. and you've presented a compelling strategy. The problem with it, it's not a problem. That's what I'm saying. I never want to be too harsh, because he's done a good job as a psychologist, but then it's just kind of left off. So maybe this is less directed at Jordan Peterson and more towards churches, because I think Jordan Peterson gives bad advice to churches when he says, stop trying to save the bloody planet. Mm-hmm. That's when I hear, I actually laughed out loud, because earlier he said, every man wants a garden to walk in. And then he says, stop saving the bloody planet. I'm like, well, I guess that was metaphorical then. He didn't mean literally, don't save the gardens of the world. So this is again, where it's a deficiency with what he's saying, is that he doesn't try to fill in what that purpose to call men to live for should actually be. And when he does allude to it and says something like, stop saving the planet, he's making a claim about what those purposes should look like. Oddly enough, Jesus is actually also interested in redeeming heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. And he says, behold, I am making all things new. Mm-hmm. And so the kingdom of God actually includes saving the planet. Right. And so there are some ways where it's moments like that where I went, he said, you're the church, save souls. That's what you're meant to do. And I was just kind of like, you're dichotomizing the physical and the spiritual. You've now approached commenting on the purposes we should live for, and you've actually done so with a modern Western understanding, and you've actually in some ways misstepped away from that which Orthodox Christians should go, which is that Jesus wants to redeem all things, souls, but also the planet. Yeah. Yeah. So that's where I just went, it became more obvious as the video went on. Okay. Now he is making some theological statements, and this is where I would go. He has a deficient view of what the kingdom of God really means, but he's not even really talking about that.
Right. And I think it, if you boil it right down, again, it comes back to what I continue to hear as I'm listening. I listen to what he says about Jesus and God, and I listen very closely to exactly what he's saying. And it's funny, I listened to him talk to someone like a Bishop Robert Barron, who is a very well-regarded and well-schooled Catholic theologian.
Mm-hmm.
And they're talking together, but I can almost hear them talking past each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it all boils down to this, that for Peterson, in his mind, it isn't God who's there. It's the divine in some way, shape, or form. And
yeah, he's a Platonist.
Right. And
yeah.
That's right. It's the unseen realm of the forms. And ultimately that will remain forever mysterious and unknown.
Right.
Our only access to the divine is in the way it works itself out on the human horizontal level through these kinds of psychological archetypical patterns that we see through history repeated over and over again. Those are the human manifestations of the divine that point us to something greater. And so in his mind, it's to our ill and to our doom that we ignore these things, including archetypical masculine traits. And so he's calling us back to that. But you're right. But he is missing the fact that there is an other that we look to fulfill all these things. The other is God. He's personal. He is ontologically, his being transcends ours. And so he's still not there. And so that's why I just say, like, he's so observant, and I think he really is seeing some of the things that God has hard baked into his creation that does reflect his character and his nature and his intention for us. He's observing those things, but he still doesn't see the God who's behind them.
Yeah, I think part of it is that he has a Western modernistic understanding of Christianity. And I think, and that leads him to say things like, save souls, don't save the planet. And it's just like, well, God happens to be present in all those things and care about them. And and I think, I think you're right. Like, he has a notion of the divine, but if you don't have Christ, then you have no real notion of Trinity, and you have no real notion of incarnation, and you have no real notion of death and resurrection. And I think all three of those things are central to what it means to know God. All three of those concepts are central. And then also to live out the kingdom of God. All three of those things are central. So I mean, that's where, again, like, I feel like I want to be gracious to him in this video to just go, I think he like my headline is, he does a really good job of identifying psychology and telling churches this is real and you should pay attention to it. He doesn't do a very good job of laying out how that connects to Christian theology. To any Christians listening, I would say the danger is that you're just then going to import maybe even your deficient idea of what it means to live for God. And then you're going to inspire young men to do that, right? Like, cults are motivating for the exact same reason. They give you something to live for. They give you a strong social structure. They give you clear roles. They also try to coerce you. But like, if like that desire to like live for something can be fulfilled by even destructive things. So my critique is, he identifies that, he says use it, but he doesn't have a Christian worldview in order to actually pastor churches and how to do that well. So that's where I go, he's not wrong.
Yeah, no,
but
he's not.
What he's saying could be dangerous if used by the wrong people.
Yeah, and that is my concern. My concern is, as I read, it's just an interesting phenomenon, because I don't want to be dismissive because I'm not hearing all the theological points that I want to hear. Because I think God puts people on a journey in different ways toward him. But there is such a it seems like he's garnering such a following among Christians who see him as a spokesperson for Christianity. And again, I think all the points you've hit are true. From a psychologist's point of view, I think he's tapped into some important insights. But he's not yet, if I can put it this way, from everything he's said so far, I haven't seen that he's yet found Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it's to answer that question that you asked at the beginning, which was, should we put him, at the tip of the spear as someone that we can all rally behind? And this, I don't feel any judgment towards him, but I think the answer is no. I don't think that we should.
No.
And that's just because he's a great psychologist, but he's not a great theologian. And I don't consider myself to be, some brilliant theologian, but the fact that I'm kind of going, oh man, I actually have some problems with what you're saying. I think you've missed Jesus on some levels. I think that he says things, so I would be hesitant to go, yeah, Jordan Peterson represents what I think about following Jesus. I don't think that would be true. And that's where, I don't want to twice exile him. He has something to bring to this conversation.
Yeah.
I believe he is on, is experiencing God. I think that, by his own account, that he's not necessarily decided to become a follower of Jesus, but it seems as though he has experienced something of, the transcendent, and he's drawn towards it from other interviews I've seen. That
definitely. There's a number of interviews. There was one a couple years ago or a year ago. It was one that went viral where he broke down talking about Jesus, and I went back and really had a good listen to that. And I think I do. I see him as someone who really is on a journey of discovery. And I really think he is continually thinking through, trying to figure out the connection that Jesus is, or that Jesus makes. And I feel like he's still stumbling over his psychological matrix, and has not yet seen Jesus as the King, as the one. Not the one who points us to some greater reality, but the one who is the end of all things. But I see him as he's on a journey. So again, I'm rooting for him. I'm praying for him.
I find him to be introspective and reflective, and those are traits that I really appreciate. So I really appreciate his work on that.
Well, yeah, one caution I am sensing, and one of my concerns, and again, this comes back to Christians who are getting on the bandwagon with Jordan Peterson, so to speak. There's just a bit of an error in some of his statements or the way he spoke. A little bit of an error, think again, sunshine, right? It's just some of the ways he almost scolding, which concerns me a bit, that there's a bit of, I don't want to say arrogance, but it almost seems a bit that way. But I think that's just a hint of a greater concern I have in seeing him also become allied with what is, in the media world anyway, a very right-wing reaction to the very left-wing media voice of they want to call it the woke media or whatever. He just joined the Daily Wire, which is a right-wing media outlet. So, joining such personalities as Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin and others, Candace Owen and such. I admit I listen to some of the things they have to say, because I think some of the things they have to say are interesting. I try to consume a balance of media. My concern, though, is that very much represents what I see as a kind of the most public side of what we might call the culture war going on. It's a very polarized us versus them battle, an ideological battle. It's an ideological battle raging over Western culture. They're the classical liberal or libertarians trying to maintain liberal Western freedom, represented or idealized by the West, against the invasion of kind of this more socialist, left-wing, Marxist ideology. And that seems to me to be the ideological battle going on in the culture. My concern is that Christians are going to jump into that battleground.
Yeah.
I don't think Christianity is either one of those.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, I think a good just kind of like context cue here is that he's talking about these things like a North American. And I'm a North American and you are, but I live in Europe. And so, so for him to dichotomize the planet versus souls, no church that I've been to in Scotland has any, like, that kind of dichotomy is crazy. Here they are very, they live on an island, if sea levels rise, this is a problem. So they care and they talk about the environment. And,
Right.
and so the idea that wouldn't be part of and they talk about the environment in church, in a real way. This is God's creation. How do we steward it? What do we do? How do we live responsibly? How do we tend the garden?
Yeah.
These are things that actually happen here. So I will say, like, he is approaching these things in the context of the North American culture war. And I think that you're right. And that hit me too. A few times he used, what David Fitch in his book, Us versus Them, calls banner issues. I think when he says, stop fighting social justice, stop saving the bloody planet, he's tapped into that us versus them narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's enforced it.
Yeah.
And that's where I sit, where I am now, and just go, he is tapping into that. And I'm agreeing with you that I think that is part of the danger, that some people hear this and go, yeah, we're the church. Let's, we got to save souls. That's what we're about. Like, let's bring all these, and they'll just kind of adopt it. And I think there are different levels. There's theological levels, there's cultural levels, where there's a bit of an echo chamber happening here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think even, the Scots that I hang out with would watch that video, and a few things they would just be like, what? I don't understand. So it's a North American video for North American people is what I'm saying. It's not that way everywhere.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good observations. And I think you're right. And that is the heart of my concern too, is that as Christians, we jump onto these kinds of polarized positions. And again, it might be, well, yeah, we got to join Team Peterson and recover masculinity because the culture is trying to destroy masculinity. Well, again, there's parts of what he said that we can glean from. But
definitely.
But at the same time, everyone who's concerned with environmental issues, climate change, and all the rest is not so because they're Marxists.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so to even kind of frame ourselves in those kinds of caricatures, you run the risk of, okay, we're going to align ourselves with this group. Well, then we're alienating a whole lot of people that Jesus calls us to reach and who have real concerns. And it's not because they're supporting the invasion of communism into the West. It's because they're concerned about the environment, and rightly so.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think there is, I don't want to say a danger, because it's like we could just be just as what's the word I'm looking for? Like, just as sensationalizing, like Jordan Peterson's dangerous because he doesn't understand Christian theology.
Right,
like,
I don't want to say that.
And I think at the end of the day, I'd watch this video and go, I think he makes some good psychological points to consider. And I think mature Christian leaders should digest it. And I don't think Jordan Peterson wants to be, the representative for Christianity. And I do think there's something very powerful. We talked about culture wars. Like, I think the idea that you would set up a person who would be like your champion, like, I think that whole kind of language comes out of fear-driven culture war, us versus them, thinking we need someone who's going to stand up to the scary person online that I don't like, and who's going to tell them they're dumb and they got it wrong. And Jordan Peterson seems to be able to do that. And sometimes Ben Shapiro seems to be able to do that. Right. And so we like these people.
Yeah.
That I have that is like red flag to the max for me, that we are choosing champions that don't really reflect Christ, who is our champion, who is our sacrificial lamb. So he even has a different way of going about championing our enemies.
Right.
And
again,
so we
because so much of those battles, those cultural battles, are ideological. They're and very much political in many ways. They're different versions of how should we best create the perfect world. Neither of them have at the center King Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the warning. As Christians, that's what we have to continually keep in mind, is that we are neither libertarians or capitalists or democrats or socialists or We're none of those things. We're Christ followers, and we're called to follow him in whatever social system we happen to find ourselves in. Now, that doesn't excuse us, of course, from being involved in the political process. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
But that's not where our allegiance is. And we're called to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the political system we live in might look like, or ideological world we live in might look like.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of make it a tweetable thing, like at the end of the day, it is always tempting to put forward champions, but there really is no champion worthy of representing Christianity but Christ.
Yep.
And that's where I just, after all the scandals and everything that have come out, like nothing's too big to fail but God, and no one's too good to fail but Jesus. And I'm getting more and more comfortable with having fewer heroes and just
one hero,
not wanting a champion, but Jesus and his way, So if Jordan Peterson had said, hey, we all have these deep desires and that's part of maleness and it's okay to pursue that. And then the second half of the video, he should have just said, and it looks something like this: seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Yeah. If he had said that, I would have gone, great theology, let churches sort it out.
Right.
With people.
Yeah.
Because that's it. He needed to give them a kingdom to strive for. And unfortunately, he didn't really do that. He kicked the can to churches, which is not bad, but he didn't offer a lot.
Yeah. And I'm not sure the practical tips he gave us to do that will work anyway. I just don't think billboards and flyers are going to, if they were, if it would work.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure someone will try it. I'd love to hear a story, if it does work somehow. But
well, I think maybe that's just, maybe he didn't literally mean that, but that was just more representative of sending a clear message, maybe by the way that we do ministry and by the way that we disciple in the church. Let's disciple men as men.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, I can sense that we're kind of coming down here, and that's fine. I just, I don't know if I have more to say other than what I've already said. I just feel like it would almost be a stronger video if he had just said, I think Christianity has something to offer men in terms of filling that desire. So offer it to them.
Yeah.
Then he's kind of acknowledging, I'm not a theologian. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you how your church tries to disciple people. I'm going to pass that off to you, but I'm going to give you a helpful insight into male psychology. I think that would have been stronger. And he would have not said the theological things that I think are wrong.
Well, let me just, so I don't misquote. Maybe this is where we can end then, since that Peterson didn't quite say what he needed to say as far as what men really needed to hear. So maybe we can end with this, and I'll just end with the words of Jesus, because this is where he needed to point them. Exactly what you said. What Jesus' message wasn't, come and be a man like I'm a man. I'll show you the way to be a man. Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Take my yoke, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You're exactly right. Where he needed to leave them with was with Jesus.
Yeah, and to prevent just firing men up to be brash and excited. He didn't. Yeah, I mean, what is beautiful about Jesus is his passion and his care and his purpose and his intensity in moments and his deliberateness. But also, what is inspiring about Jesus is his humility and his kindness and his compassion. Like that also it should not be extracted from what it means to be a man who's living a
Right.
meaningful, purposeful life,
Right.
to actually humble yourself. Wow. So that you don't get humbled, but to humble yourself. Right. And when you were talking about those moments that smacked of arrogance, that's where it's like, well, don't accidentally call men to just turn that part of themselves up to 10, because what it means to be a man is also to humble yourself and to submit yourself. Like, let's not act like submission is not a part of what Jesus teaches it means to be a godly man.
Absolutely. And again,
Yeah.
back to the thing, something, just the way I put it earlier, is that I think broadly he wants to try and recover masculinity as a truly a life-giving human characteristic. And in principle, I think he's right. In practice, I think he's pointing men in the wrong direction, which is to tap into their true masculinity. And I think what we're trying to say is, no. You do that by tapping into Jesus and living out masculinity the way Jesus lived it out, which includes all those things. To me, that's much more hopeful too, because tapping into your true masculinity, that only sounds that's only compelling if you're that kind of man. If you're the, I got to be a man's man kind of man. Not all men are wired that way. Some are not as quote unquote, they're not masculine in that way. But that's not true masculinity. I mean, those are surface features, but Jesus really does show us what truly being a man is about.
Yeah, and that's why I say, I did say earlier, this is the most critical I'll be of him. I feel like he does say something true, but it's actually not, I don't find it to be that profound.
Right.
I look at my life and go, oh yeah, he's right. He identified something that's true of me, but he didn't tell me how to go about it and whether, the version I have of it in my head is truly good and kind and beautiful, or if it's distortive. He didn't do that difficult work.
Yeah.
Of laying out what that would look like. And maybe he didn't intend to. So then I just go, okay, he made a video and he made his point, I think, well.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, long and short of it is that there was good and bad. That's why I thought it was something, a worthwhile discussion to have. I think he's raising important conversations in the broader culture. That's why I appreciate what he is doing. I mean, he has been the tip of the spear in many ways, and it's cost him personally. In terms of health, in terms of stress and all the rest. So, I mean, I do appreciate his contribution. But I think it's just a good reminder that, these are things we need to think about, but also recognize that they're terribly nuanced conversations. So at least it's good practice to be able to talk about them without being all against or all for. We can just see some good and some bad, and glean a bit from it. That's just a good practice in general.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, if I'm going to live by my philosophy of no hero but Jesus, that puts me in the camp of no matter how much I respect someone, whether it be Jordan Peterson or some philosopher or theologian I really love, like everything needs to be discerned by them.
Right.
Because I can't trust them the way that I trust Jesus.
Well, I don't know a better way to finish our conversation than with that. Yeah, that too is very tweetable.
This was fun. This was very fun.
Thanks for listening to the Prepared to Answer podcast. You can get future episodes as well as listen to past episodes by subscribing on iTunes or Spotify. And you can get many other faith-building resources by following us on YouTube, Facebook, or finding us online at preparedtoanswer.org. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again.